Welcome, dear participants, to this virtual roundtable, Global Trends in the Law Challenges for the European Union. This is a virtual roundtable that takes place at the occasion of the publication of the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index 2020. My name is Kolja Raube. I'm an assistant professor for European Studies at KU Leuven and project manager at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven. And I will be moderating this roundtable. So good morning to everybody, good afternoon, and even good evening if you are tuning in from Asia. This event is organized in partnership with the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law and the World Justice Project, which for the past decade has been providing citizens, governments, donors, businesses, and civil society organizations with a comprehensive comparative analysis of countries' adherence to universal rule of law principles. This virtual panel discussion is, in fact, a very good opportunity to present and discuss the latest findings from the 2020 World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. Now, we are dealing today with a topic which goes to the heart of much of our work in the context of the Horizon 2020 project RECONNECT, which focuses on reconciling the EU to its citizens through democracy and the rule of law. And the goal we have set ourselves is to explain and provide solutions to the deepening disconnect between the Union on the one hand and its citizens in the context of recent crises, such as the challenges of migration, economy, and security. Now, in times of the spread of the coronavirus, we opted for a virtual roundtable that would still allow us to connect across the Atlantic Ocean and connect between the empirical evidence which the World Justice Project is providing in its latest report on the one hand, and the qualitative analysis on the ground on the other hand, especially with regards to the European Union. And to this end, we have actually a number of panelists gathered here during our roundtable. It's my particular pleasure to introduce all of them to you. First of all, I would like to introduce Ted Piccone. Ted Piccone is Chief Engagement Officer at the World Justice Project in Washington, D.C. I would also like to introduce Dr. Alejandro Ponce. Dr. Ponce is Chief Research Officer at the World Justice Project, also based in Washington, D.C., and Natasha Kazachkine. Natasha Kazachkine is Head of Unit for Internal EU Affairs at the Open Society European Policy Institute, based in Brussels. Also, we have Alex Andrione Moilan in the background, who will bring your questions to the fore. I will tell you a little bit later how you can do that. Unfortunately, Joanna Goody, the Director of Research from the EU Fundamental Rights Agency in Vienna, cannot join us today. Now, just a little bit to tell you how we are organizing this webinar. After the first presentations by Ted Piccone and Dr. Ponce, I will hand over the floor to Natasha Kazachkine, and in the meantime, all participants can actually write their questions in the little chat box, which you see in the webinar, to bring to the fore your questions for the Q&A, which we immediately afterwards will run. So please send your questions throughout the whole debate. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand over the microphone to Ted Piccone from the World Justice Project to give us a first idea of the definition of the rule of law, which has been used to address the rule of law in the 2020 report. Ted, it's your floor.
Great. Thanks very much, Kolja. And thank you everyone for joining us today. In light of all these difficult circumstances, I think we're learning things about technology and how to stay connected. And we're delighted to welcome you. We're disappointed, of course, that we couldn't physically be in Brussels together, but we're making the most of it. I just want to say very briefly a few remarks before turning over to Alejandro for the presentation. On behalf of our board, our officers and staff, I want to in particular thank the Leuven University's Global Governance Study Center and the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law for co-sponsoring this event with us. And for those of you who are new to the World Justice Project, we're an independent, multidisciplinary organization working to advance the rule of law around the world. And we do this in several ways. First, by collecting and analyzing original, independent rule of law data. And we present this in the Rule of Law Index, which you will hear a lot more about in just a few moments. We also produce thematic reports on key rule of law topics, like our Global Insights on Access to Justice report. And we also do quite a bit of work in Mexico, where we look at things at the subnational level, and we're looking to do that in other parts of the world as well. Second, we support research and scholarship and teaching about the importance of the rule of law, its relationship to development, and effective strategies to strengthen it. And third, we're building an engaged global network of policymakers, experts, and activists through strategic convenings, knowledge exchanges like this one, coordinated campaigns, and locally led initiatives to advance the rule of law. We are particularly proud of our biennial World Justice Forum and invite you to please save the date for the next one, which will take place in The Hague, the Netherlands, May 25th through 28th of 2021. So next year, we hope to see you all there at The Hague. So very briefly, why should we care about the rule of law? We know from research and experience that effective rule of law is associated with reduced corruption, with lower levels of poverty and disease, and higher protection of human rights. It's the foundation for communities of justice, opportunity, and peace. With more rule of law comes higher GDP, greater democracy and peace, and better health and education outcomes. Beyond these correlative effects, the rule of law is an indispensable principle in its own right. It reminds us that all are endowed with fundamental rights to human dignity and justice, and that no one is above the law. For more than a decade, we've worked to promote a universal definition of the rule of law and rigorous technical indicators for measuring it. In summary, we define the rule of law as a durable system of laws, institutions, norms, and community commitment that delivers four universal principles. First, everyone is accountable under the law, everyone. Second, the laws are clear, just, and evenly applied. Third, the process of enacting, administering, enforcing laws is open. And fourth, justice is impartial and accessible to all. To measure how these rule of law principles are experienced and perceived by the general public worldwide, we created the WJP Rule of Law Index, drawing on surveys carried out in 128 countries and jurisdictions in every region of the world. The index is a diagnostic tool for identifying a country's strengths and weaknesses in areas such as fundamental rights, justice delivery, corruption, open government, and effective checks and balances. And we believe it is the most comprehensive data set of its kind and a really important resource as original data for the rule of law. It is our hope and intention that these findings will be a powerful resource for advocates, policymakers, researchers, businesses, legal professionals, and others looking to improve the rule of law in their countries. And with that opening, I want to turn it back to Kolja. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ted, for this very interesting first introduction to the methodology which you are using in your project. And I think without further comments from my side, we should give the floor to Alejandro Ponce, who will introduce now the findings of the 2020 index and its complementary report. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kolja. Thank you very much to our partners for organizing this. Just share my screen. Well, it's a pleasure to present the results of the 2020 Rule of Law Index. This latest edition summarizes the views of more than 130,000 people and 4,000 legal practitioners all around the world who gave us their views and experiences about issues such as the quality of government, their interactions with the courts, the police, their perceptions about accountability, openness, or the experiences with the level of violence, for example, that they are regularly exposed. So this information is organized in This information is organized in 9 factors or indicators that we called. Constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental rights, order and security, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, criminal justice, and informal justice. So these indicators summarize 2 basic ideas that are core to the concept of the rule of law. The first one is that the law imposes limits on the exercise of power by authorities. And those ideas are comprised in the first 4 factors of the rule of law index. The second idea encompasses the notion that the state also limits the actions that members of society can do and fulfills its duties towards its citizens. So in order to preserve the order in society, to preserve the public good, and to provide mechanisms for people to solve disputes and redress grievances through the justice system. Now, each one of the factors are further disaggregated into what we call sub-factors, which are outcomes that rule of law societies want to achieve. For example, when we talk about open government, we measure whether the laws are publicized and the people have access to government data, the right to information, civic participation, or complaint mechanisms. The same way, when we talk about fundamental right, we talk about absence of discrimination, due process of law, freedom of opinion, etc. So each one of the different factors are further disaggregated into smaller concepts that all of them are outcomes that rule of law societies want to achieve. Overall, these 9 factors are further disaggregated into 47 sub-factors. The report that we present today essentially summarizes over 500 variables that draw from the experiences and perceptions of 130,000 household interviews and more than 4,000 legal practitioners surveyed in 128 countries and jurisdictions in total. As compared to previous year, we added 2 countries this year, so we added Kosovo and the Gambia. To go a little bit into the methodology, so in each country, we interview 1,000 people, usually through nationally representative surveys, not in all cases. In some cases, it's simply in the 3 largest cities, in which we ask people about their perceptions and experiences with different government institutions. Then we supplement that information with surveys to legal practitioners in civil law, criminal law, labor law, and practitioners in public health, in which we ask questions about their day-to-day experiences interacting with various institutions as well. And we supplement that as well with third-party sources, just probably a few questions only that touch on topics related, for example, to civil conflict or terrorism or coup d'etats that are difficult to capture through surveys. So the weight of this information is approximately 65% of the survey or the questions come from the experts, and about 25% come from the surveys, from the household surveys, and the rest come from the third-party sources. Also, the specific weight and number of questions really depend on the factor that we're measuring. There are some that are measured more heavily, just with household interviews. There are some others that are mainly captured through expert surveys, such as civil justice or criminal justice. Before going to the global results, let me talk a little bit about where you can find information. So all the information is available in our website. So recently we revamped the website. You can find the scores as well as the rankings, how the different scores have changed over time for each one of the factors and sub-factors for the countries, compare countries, and so on. The scores are also presented in the forms of tables. The tables, the scores are presented in a score that ranges between 0 and 1, when 1 signifies higher adherence to the rule of law. And we also present the results by income or by region. We also present the results by factor. And more importantly, we present the results by country in country profiles. In each one of the country profiles, you can see the overall score, as well as the regional rank, the income group rank, and the global rank. You can see as well how the score changed from the previous year and the rank change. And importantly, you can see the information for each one of the factors, the scores, the factor change, whether the change was statistically significant or not. And we can also see the information for each one of the sub-factors that is included in the index. Now, let me just go to some of the findings that we have at a global scale. First off, the top performers and the bottom performers. The top performers are Denmark, Norway, and Finland. And these countries have remained in the same position for the last 3 years, and in some cases they have increased their score. The bottom performers are the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cambodia, and Venezuela. These countries also were in the bottom positions in the previous index. Some of the countries that improved the most from the previous year to this one, two notable examples are Ethiopia, that increased by 5.6%, driven mainly by changes in factor 1, constraints on government powers, and factor 4, fundamental rights. Constraints on government powers measure essentially the checks on the power of government, such as legislative overview, judicial independence, independent audit and review, non-governmental checks, or fair elections, for example. Then we also have Malaysia, that increased by 5.1%, also driven by factor 1, constraints on government powers, factor 4, which is fundamental rights, and regulatory enforcement. We'll see also some changes in other parts of the world, in Latin America, El Salvador, in Africa, Angola, that increased by 3.1%, and Mauritania, as well as some countries that have done some changes recently, such as Uzbekistan, that increased by 1.7%. In Europe, we saw increases in Slovenia, mainly driven by civil justice, and in Moldova, mainly driven by factor 1 as well, the constraints on government power. Looking at the countries that improve the most and decline the most in each one of the different regions of the world, you are able to see some of these, and notable on top of the countries that I just mentioned, other examples of countries that improve: Afghanistan. Just on the other side, countries that decline in their scores: Cameroon declined their score in Africa by 5.1%, Iran by 5.2%. In Europe, the UK by 1.7% was the country that declined its score the most, and just it showed a decline in almost all of the different dimensions of the rule of law. Now let me show you just how overall the countries are moving. So this scatter plot shows in the x-axis the percentage change in score since last year, and in the y-axis the index score of this year. So the countries that are at the top are countries that are above the median, the countries that are at the bottom are countries that are below the median, and the countries at the left are countries that experience a decline since the previous year. What you will see is that the majority of countries, so you will see countries in the middle were not presented, just to simplify the graph. So just we put it at changes above or below 0.5%. What you will be able to see there is that more countries declined their score than improved. Overall, 55 countries declined their score from previous year, as compared to 40 countries that improved their score over the previous year. This decline has been constant for a third year in a row. So this is the third year in a row in which we see more countries decline their score in rule of law than improving their score. In this chart, we are able to see that compare the changes from the previous year to changes over the last 5 years. We know that the rule of law moves from one year to the next, but it's important just to see how these changes evolve over time. We know that rule of law, just in many cases, it's relatively constant. So then we want to see how these indicators actually evolve over time. What we're able to see here is the following. So then on the x-axis is the change in last year, in the y-axis the change since the last 5 years. So then at the bottom left corner, we're able to see out of those countries that declined last year, 28 countries actually declined the previous year, the previous 5 years, as opposed to 22 countries that somehow improved their scores in the last 5 years. So what we'll see is that trajectories are not necessarily monotonic. Countries are changing. In some cases they are declining, but suddenly improve, and the other way around. And in many cases, these are related to changes in political regimes. The chart at the right essentially shows how the distribution of countries have been moving just in scores, just the percentage of countries that are in each one of the brackets of the scores. And we see just there is a tendency towards declining rule of law, but this is not as present. And we will see there are some specific factors that have been declining more, specifically those related to accountability, constraints on government powers, fundamental rights, but there are some others that really haven't declined as much, particularly those related to institutional performance in regulatory enforcement and civil justice and criminal justice, as I will show you in a minute. So the report also shows the changes over the previous year. So this is a table. I don't expect you to see the results of the table right now, but you can look at those in detail in the report and online. The main point here, as I was mentioning before, is that many countries actually just experience either just stagnation or small changes or small declines. So there are only a few countries that have experienced either constant deterioration or constant improvement. Again, this is mainly driven by changes in government. Turning to what is driving these results, in this chart, you're able to see the number of countries that have improved or declined their score. We put a band just to determine just those that really didn't have moved in each one of the different factors. So the dark figures, for example, show in the first case that 41% of countries declined their scores in constraints on government power, as opposed to 22% that improved their scores. So the most notable thing in this chart is over the previous year, just more countries saw declines in 3 factors, which is constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, and fundamental rights. In all those cases, you will see that the number of countries that decline their scores is almost double the amount of countries that improve their scores. Then in the shaded case, we will be able to see the countries that have declined or improved their scores over the last 5 years. And the picture is even more contrasting. So we'll be able to see as well in factor 1 and factor 4, which are constraints of government power and fundamental rights, just how much more countries have declined their scores than improved. On the other side, we were able to see that in other dimensions, there is stagnation, if you want, so on regulatory enforcement and civil justice over the previous year, with probably civil justice, a slight larger amount of countries have shown an improvement over those that shown a decrease. But over the last 5 years, we see just that more countries have actually improved their scores than declined. As a global trend, something that we're seeing is that more countries, as I mentioned before, have been declining their scores in government powers, constraints on government powers, checks on the power of the executive, judicial independence, legislative review, independent audit, freedom of the press, and so on. These are some of the cases of the countries that have declined the most over the previous year. we'll be able to see just in Europe, for example, Albania decreased by almost 7%. In other regions of the world, Egypt by 9%, Morocco by almost more than 4%. In Latin America, Honduras and El Salvador and Brazil importantly showed a decline. In Asia, Philippines as well. So this one is the same picture, but when we look at changes from the last 5 years, this is just the average change that countries have experienced over the last 5 years. And so you can interpret this as the average annual change, so similar as we will present it in economic growth, for example. So then we'll be able to see some countries that have been deteriorating over the years. For example, in the case of Europe, we have Poland that has been declining by 6.1% on average, Hungary by 5.3%, Bosnia and Herzegovina by 5.4%, and Serbia by 6.2%, Bulgaria 3.4%, and Albania 4.7%. So this is in factor one, so which measures again checks on the power of the executive and that have accumulated over the years. So this is a similar chart to the one that I presented before, in which we show the percentage or the number of countries that have declined over the previous year against the number of countries that have declined over the last 5 years. And then we'll see a picture that is more pronounced than the one that I showed at the beginning when we look at the comprehensive picture of the rule of law. So when we only look at the core elements of checks on government power of accountability, we'll be able to see that most of the countries that declined the previous year have actually been declining over the last 5 years. So 41 countries declined in the past year and declined the past 5 years, as opposed to 19 countries that declined in the past year but improved in the last 5 years, or countries that improved the last year but has been declining in the past 5 years, only 21. And then when we look at the chart at the right, then we're able to see just how the number of countries with lower scores have been increasing, since 2015 to 2019, showing a deterioration in factor one. So quickly going to some regions in the world, Asia, just the country that showed the most decline. China showed 1.5% and Mongolia 2.2%, and the countries that show an improvement, Malaysia with an increase of 5.1% and Indonesia 1.3%. The contrasting picture of China and Hong Kong. China showed a decrease, Hong Kong showed a decrease, but not as strong as the one experienced by China. And when we look at the figures by each one of the factors, we see that China actually has been declining over the last 5 years in factor one, checks and balances, while Hong Kong has experienced a deterioration as well. It hasn't been as pronounced as the one in China, and overall the picture is much more stable than the one that we have seen in China. Now turning to changes in Europe. So Europe, first to begin, still remains the continent with the strongest rule of law overall, and many countries indeed have experienced improvements when we see the last 5 years. However, something interesting to notice during the previous year is that most countries, or at least half of the countries in Western Europe, experienced declines in the rule of law scores, with countries such as the United Kingdom, as I mentioned before, experienced 1.7% decline, France, Portugal, Austria, Greece, all of them experience declines in the overall rule of law score. The circumstances are different in different countries, but this is a trend that we are seeing. Romania. Then importantly, I want to point us some countries, the case of Poland and Hungary, where, as I mentioned before, we have been seeing declines in the areas of constraints on government powers, in the case of Poland by more than 25%, in the case of Hungary by more than 20%, and fundamental rights as well, just 17% and 11%, respectively, as well as criminal justice that has also seen a decline in their scores almost by 20% in the case of Poland and 15% in the case of Hungary. Looking at two other countries, just that it's interesting to keep a look at. So Romania, we show that Romania show a decline last year, particularly last year, just 1.5% decrease. What you see here as well is the change that Romania has experienced over the last 5 years. So it still is a country that overall has been remained constant, in some cases improved, but the last year showed an important decline. Bulgaria, just in contrast, is a country that has shown more declines over the last few years, particularly constraints on government powers and fundamental rights. Then turning to the Western Balkans, as I was mentioning before, so Bosnia showed an important decline the previous year and has also shown declines over the last few years, just in different areas. Serbia improved a little bit, but has shown a decline over the previous year. North Macedonia declined a little bit. Their score is the same as Albania. And this year we have included Kosovo. This is the first time that we have included the country, so it doesn't show any change over the previous year. So you can download the report online as well as on the website, just where you can see different scores and compare rankings across different countries. And then with this, I'm going back to Kolja. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for this very interesting observation and in fact the very interesting findings that you bring forward to the table, some of them which are obviously up for debate, I guess, seeing France in the same camp as some of the other European countries, which we very often refer to when we talk about the decline of the rule of law in Europe, for example, is obviously quite interesting. And perhaps we can address in our questions and answers, but also the comparative data that you look at, especially looking at some of the trends in Asia, where we can see the decline of the rule of law on the one hand, but there are certain factors which I saw potentially balancing some of the findings, right? Like regulatory enforcement, for example. Perhaps we can talk about that, to which degree these factors are also showing us a particular trend of how governments are looking at the rule of law, even potentially what their interpretation of the rule of law is, because we know that there are very different interpretations around the globe of what the rule of law is and how to actually enforce it. Keeping a little bit our focus on Europe, because we obviously wanted to do this in our webinar today, I think it's very important that your report again highlights some of the acute challenges which Europe is facing. And when I talk about Europe, I mean EU member states, but as I think you also showed, some of the accession candidates are struggling with the rule of law, even declined in the rule of law, according to your findings in the last year. So there is a lot that we can actually bring in the debate, and I would ask all our attendees to actually question and put forward their questions in our chat box while we are speaking. We will come back to them in, let's say, 15 minutes. Undoubtedly, the Commission, the European Commission, is of course both one of the most engaged actors when it comes to the rule of law, both within the EU, but also when it deals with the accession states, the potential member states of the future. Of course, already in 2014, faced with the necessity of an additional instrument, the Commission adopted the so-called rule of law framework. There has been a lot of debate about how successful it has actually been. Some in the debate highlighting the potential of its dialogue function with the member states, while others are pointing to the fact that the dialogue is simply not enough and certainly not a way to finally trigger Article 7, which the Commission has always pointed out would be a potential last tool that it could use, and that it has, such as in the case of Poland, also activated. In the meantime, the Commission has also launched a lot of infringement procedures. Again, some of the colleagues in the debate asked the Commission to use that tool actually even more proactively. And last but not least, in July 2019, the Commission has issued a new framework to strengthen the rule of law. Some call it an enhanced rule of law mechanism, in which the Commission has set out concrete actions to strengthen the Union's capacity to promote and uphold the rule of law, most notably by 3 measures: to enhance public information and knowledge, to actually diffuse a rule of law culture, which it observes as being missing in some of the member states of the European Union, and last but not least, a new monitoring element, a so-called rule of law review cycle. We can address all of that in our debate as well, but I think it's very important to mention that the EU institutions are not sleeping, definitely not being aware of the tendencies, the trends which it is facing in some of the EU member states and also abroad. But I will not longer, so to speak, misuse my role as a moderator, but like to stop here and actually bring in Natasha Kazachkine, who I introduced earlier, and I'm very sure that Natasha has some very good and critical comments on the presentation of Alejandro, but also on what all of that means for the current rule of law situation in Europe. Natasha, it's your turn.
Yes, thank you very much, Axel. Thank you to the organizers and congratulations to the World Justice Project for this impressive study once again. This is an exercise that you've been doing over the years. I also want to thank Alejandro for his presentation and very useful insights into the situation worldwide. And I will refer also to what Axel said just now. This comes in at a particular moment for the EU when the EU institutions are embarking on a new cycle on rule of law, monitoring rule of law, but also acting on rule of law and protection of rule of law in member states. So what I will do is just come in with some remarks, picking up the conversation from the perspective of a civil society representative, which I am here, and a human rights advocate working on EU internal policies. My first remark is to say that it's very good to have, I think, those discussions on EU put in with this context of the World Justice Project study. Why? Because it reminds us one thing that is very important, that rule of law is a global issue, that it's not only about us in Europe, and we have a lot to learn and from all over the world. The very important thing it reminds us also is that the principles we are looking at, and they're the ones you are relying on in your study, are universal principles. They're not the property of the EU or its member states. They are some principles that are binding for all the member states and for the EU institutions, but they're not their own thing that they've decided on and are ruling on. And for the EU, this is very important for a discussion because they happen to be the foundation of its very project and of its very policies. And we need to really remind ourselves that the objective of the EU, as put in its treaties, is to respect, protect, and promote these principles inside and outside the EU. So it's really the aim of the EU, not only the foundation that should guide its work, the bedrock against everything else, but also a policy and essential objective of why it exists. The other thing I think was interesting was reminding us by Ted of how important rule of law is for all of us in our everyday lives. This is something that the Commission is in particular, but the EU is keen to explain better to citizens and to make real. Maybe it took it for granted for many years that this was something all of us joined the projects, all of our countries, not really realizing. And now I think this is very important to remind or to explain and to get into how rule of law is actually very important. And there are examples in the report always when it comes to health, access to health, for business to strive, for people to have their security, etc. And of course, the other point related to that is part of the methodology of the World Justice Project, which is to rely not only on experts in the fields of constitutional law or special aspects of law, but also on those from the population. And this is something also very interesting. We had discussions prior to this webinar with the Fundamental Rights Agency, and it was going to bring in actually some of the surveys that the Fundamental Rights Agencies did, which really look into particular what some vulnerable groups or minority groups, how they perceive justice in their country and their protection. And I was looking at a conference from the president of the Court of Justice of the EU, and I just want to remind everyone of something of how he defined the rule of law. And he was and he's been also saying that very clearly in some RECONNECT conference. And he says rule of law guarantees that those who are in power cannot oppress those who lack the capacity to defend themselves. And I think we absolutely need to keep this in mind when we have all these expert or policy discussions on what rule of law is and what country or not and government respects it or not. The other remark I want to bring in for the EU debate is on the definitions. So not so much just the methodology, but also the definitions used. It's very interesting that the World Justice Project explains how it draws a balance between what we call the thin approach to a rule of law and the thick approach to rule of law. So one would be narrowly focused on formal procedures, and one is looking at more generally also fundamental rights, civil participation, the political and legal and historical context in countries. And the World Justice Project explains very well that they need to strike this balance, if anything, to be able to compare between countries that are very different. And we see that, and everybody would have questions, that in the number of countries we're looking at, some are dictatorships, some are completely undemocratic or don't respect human rights from the start. So how are they even qualified as rule of law systems? And without, of course, going to this extreme, luckily when it comes to Europe, because I think that discrepancies are less important, and the exercise is easier in that sense than looking worldwide. I think this is not alien to the EU, this need to balance the formal and more wide approach to rule of law. I think we've seen this very much in the debates that there are issues, and also in the jurisprudence of the courts. There are issues of legal culture, while our governments and our courts and our experts and all of us have quite refined definitions of a number of features of rule of law. There are still questions on answers and difficult, arbitrage to make between, are we really in a case of a violation or not? Is this state violating also when it's doing exactly like another state is, etc.? I'll come back to that, but we'll be also very interested to hear Alejandro on the trends. And this is very important because as we saw looking at the different EU member states, some results are quite counterintuitive or don't necessarily match the idea we have of which member state is performing well or unwell. But what the vice president, first vice president of the Court of Human Rights said very eloquently in a conference is that I think this should not lead us, we should be very careful of not closing there the discussions and saying double standards, everything is relative, no intervention is legitimate. On the contrary, this should be an invitation to really look better and more closely where we can at some of these difficult questions, not avoid them. But also, and I think the survey, the study of the World Justice Project is very clear, something we are seeing is some blatant attacks today that were quite taboo in the past in Europe, or even to have these discussions now on rule of law. And there is also a component of the response of the action of the EU that must be very clear, that we need to rebuild that trust and resist some attacks on some very basic principles. So of course we need to, and we're in a privileged situations in Europe that we need to find some subtle answers and understanding and ways of discussing together rule of law, but there is also a need to remind and rebuild trust around some very key principles. The other remark is about human rights. I was very struck that the World Justice Project study shows that the highest level of decline is in the area of fundamental rights. And apparently this is not even new to this year. And I believe this is a point, a signal to the EU that human rights have to be part of the conversation on rule of law, and somewhere, somehow or another, we can talk about exactly where does it fit, in what mechanisms and how, but that ignoring the human rights dimension as a separate value of the EU that doesn't fall into our discussion on rule of law would be misleading. So building on these remarks, if I may still, yes, what does this mean for
yes,
EU? Yes, can I go ahead?
No, please go ahead. We lost you for a second, so please,
okay.
please repeat your last sentence again.
Yes, so this brings me to, I think, what maybe we all were looking at is, what does this mean? You know, what I've said, what you've presented in terms of where the EU is going and its policies. I would repeat, important not to get stuck on a very narrow and formalistic approach to rule of law issues. Analyze the trends and not only ad hoc episodes or even peaks in some member states, and Alejandro can talk about that aspect mainly. But most of all, back to my initial point, the report that we were discussing that the Commission is due to launch in July, so very soon, looking at rule of law in member states. This cannot be just another World Justice Project report. I mean, some could say we have it now and it is here to use. So I think the EU has to be, and we need to be clear that it serves a purpose and define that purpose, and how that report and other mechanisms are going to serve rule of law. One very important point is, I believe, that there is some interinstitutional commitment to take this project forward, to really enhance rule of law in Europe. Right now, the Commission, because it has done this communication and announced its monitoring report, is very much in the forefront. But we know that the European Parliament has been working a lot on rule of law issues, and and regarding certain countries, it has actually monitored the situation in those countries in particular. The council is absolutely key, the governments at the end of the day, as they are the ones being put on the spot here and asked to look at themselves and think collectively on how to protect and promote rule of law. And so it seems to me that if we want this to be a real EU institutional project, more than just a reality for the or priority for the Commission in this term, we need this interinstitutional basis. The second point is we would need to link this work on rule of law that the Commission is doing with the work and the thinking on fundamental rights and democracy. There are other initiatives that are announced. There will be a revised strategy on the implementation of the Charter. There will be a democracy action plan or pact. And somehow these elements will have to be put together to draw conclusions on where we need to work on rule of law. Finally, there needs to be an action plan following all this new monitoring and exercises and commitments, interinstitutional plan on how it's going to address all this. The action plan should look at enforcement, and I just want to say a few words that building on what Axel said, but also at positive measures and policy making for the EU. When it comes to enforcement, Axel mentioned it. We have some actions already ongoing addressing rule of law issues. We have 2 Article 7 proceedings that are underway, and we have a number of infringements. The EU, if anything, if it wants to act on rule of law, needs to be able to carry out these processes in a way that is effective and have, in the context of existing treaty procedures, substantive and responsible constructive action on the assessment it has already made with regard to Poland and Hungary, and with regard to the legal actions that it has taken. But also sometimes we don't talk about it, and they may be from these studies that you have done and the reporting of the Commission and other bodies to come, some policy initiatives to take, some gaps to look into, some trends to look at more carefully, some areas to start working on. I'm thinking of media freedom, which was not in the radar of EU. I'm thinking, and I would end with that, of civic space and the guarantee of freedom of expression and freedom of associations. These are areas where the EU has not been very active, and maybe if you look a bit at what's happening, for example, why France is declining suddenly, or the UK, there may be issues that are quite different from the issues we've seen systematically being eroded in countries like Hungary and Poland. And so to really finish, I want to end on this point on civil society. I think the project itself, but also the current, let's say, crisis we have seen in some member states, have really showed everyone the importance of having impartial, independent data on rule of law, and that it's happening. And if not possible this round with the Commission's report on rule of law, let this be a pilot. If we can't reach out or have the quality of sources that we need for such an exercise, let's be humble and have a first go. But one implication that is already there, I think, is that we need a strong, empowered civil society in all the EU countries to even engage with. If not to collect the data themselves, because we have also international or regional networks, if anything, to engage on the subject and be an interlocutor. The other thing final point is that what is very clear in the definitions, methodology of the World Justice Project, but also of the Council of Europe and of international bodies who have been monitoring and working on rule of law for decades, is the importance of civil society as an element to take into account when looking at the health of rule of law in member states. Where it be civic participation, that is key to look at open government, freedom of expression, freedom of association for fundamental rights, but also the fact that governments need to be subject to independent non-governmental checks. These are very important points. And so as civil society, and speaking also on behalf of all of those with whom we work, NGOs and civil society groups, we are really calling for special attention to be devoted to the role and the safeguarding of civil society. In the last part, they should be actors of the process, but also something that we look into when figuring out or looking at where there may be some dangers for rule of, and hopes also for rule of law in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for your very interesting comments, for taking us through all the different perspectives with regards to the project that we have heard about earlier, the report by the, which is very, very intriguing, obviously. And I think three things are especially important here. It's the role of civil society actors. It's the form, the way how we define the rule of law, that we do not look at it from a very restrictive perspective, but rather from a wider perspective. And thirdly, if I may say that there is an internal and an external dimension to the rule of law. If we, for example, look at the European Union, you mentioned an action plan which is currently missing on the inside, but which we obviously have on the outside. Right, we have already a human rights and democracy action plan for 2022-2024, and the question is, well, will the European Union be ever able and willing to use the same action plan internally, or a revised version of it? So how come that we are talking about the same phenomenon but with different instruments in place? Now, Alejandro, I will give you the floor to quickly react, and then I will pass on to Alex, who has collected the different questions from the floor.
Yes, thank you. Just very quickly, just to give some room for the questions from the audience. I think, thank you, Natasha. So this is very helpful, and I agree with your assessment. I think there's probably 3 points just to touch on both Kolja's and Natasha's remarks. So the first one is about the need for actually looking at the rule of law in a comprehensive way and looking at all the different elements of the rule of law. Usually when we, one of the main problems of embarking in these kind of conversations is that the rule of law just can mean very different things for many different people, and we should avoid that relativism and then just having different definitions and so on. What we have tried to do with the index is trying to come up first with a comprehensive measure that encompasses different elements of the rule of law, not only the core elements related to accountability and government bound by law, but some other elements that have to do with fundamental rights, and also just with the effectiveness of the government on how they are performing towards the citizens, right, in terms of security, in terms of justice, and so on. So really looking at all the different elements and in a very specific way, because then the conversations can be much more actionable on what are the kind of things that are missing. So when we simply talk broadly about the rule of law, then the conversation is lost. We just get lost in definitions about it, and really just get into the different elements, the core of the elements that encompass the rule of law to make the conversation more meaningful. No? So the index is an effort to move that conversation in that direction, and there are many. I know that the EU has made an effort as well towards doing that and really pointing at the different elements of the rule of law, and I think that should be trend to go. No, the second one, I think, is just probably the way that we see this exercise is as a tool that can complement other efforts. And I think, and I would probably point in the context of the EU, I think there are three things probably that are that I think it's the index is useful for engaging in this conversation. So the first one is, as I was mentioning before, all the different individual elements that the rule of law comprises, right? So then looking at all the individual elements, we showed indicators, and at some point we also want to disaggregate the data even further. So just to, so that we can actually look at individual elements that are coming from the public and so on, which actually have, just since they are coming from the public, have particular legitimacy to the conversation. So I think that that's number one. Number two is looking at trends. It's useful to look not only at what happened the previous year or the last 6 months, but really seeing what has been happening over the years. We were talking at some point just what's happening in France versus what's happening in Hungary. But the situation is very different. If we look at trends of maybe last year, you will see just that both countries declined. But then if we look first at the magnitude of decline, number two is at the different elements that are declining, and three, if we look at the trends over the years, the pictures are very, very different from the two countries. So it's not simply looking at one particular element, but really at all the different elements, and that's something that is quite relevant. And the third one is that it's useful to provide tools for quantifying this phenomena. So, and the reason is we all know just of particular situations when we hear about individual countries and so on, of things that are happening. The issue is, how do we contextualize and how do we compare all those situations across different countries to see which situation is worse or not? So just having more tools to try to quantify that, to put a number on that, even though sometimes the number, what do I learn from a number? Well, what you learn sometimes is that you're able to compare just with the same questions and seeing just what situations may be more concerning than others or more promising than others, just in cases in which there are positive changes when there are regime changes. So just I will stop there and just probably just open the floor for questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Alex, if I may come to you, you've collected a couple of questions in the background, so could you perhaps select a few and bring them to the table?
Of course. Thank you so much, Kolja, and thank you to the speakers for this wonderful discussion. I think it's perhaps useful to group some of the questions that we've received from the audience in two general areas. One relates more to the methodology and how you approach the rule of law index, and secondly, with regards to the trends that we've seen, especially in the context of the European Union. I guess there are a few questions that go into the direction of discussing, questioning your reliance on perceptions and on public opinion to develop this index. And so, for example, we have Elena Beeling, who asks, how do the household surveys work? How do you control for other factors, such as the manipulation of perceptions that governments can generate with regards to citizens? We have also Anna-Louise Chenet, who asks, what kinds of differences do you observe between the perceptions of experts on the one hand and the perceptions of the general public? Mm-hmm. And we have this provocation from Stefan Parmentier, who says, well, this rule of law index perhaps should be renamed the rule of law opinion index. To clarify a bit more what you rely on to come to these conclusions. Mm-hmm. With regard instead to the trends that we're seeing in the EU, I think you've partly addressed this in your reply to Natasha, but we have questions on how the data can help us explain and understand major trends that we see globally, but also trends that we're witnessing in the European Union. Axel Marx asks, for example, are we able to predict rule of law backsliding in different regions on the basis of the data that you've collected? And perhaps I would also add, are you able to distinguish, and in which way, if there is a difference between the rule of law crisis that we're witnessing within the European Union and the general trend that we see happening globally? And then perhaps one final question, again related to the specific trends that we observe in the European Union, from Ian Bond, who asks, how do you explain the general decline across the EU with regards to constraints on government power? Are you able to identify a cause of this? Is it related to concerns over terrorism, migration, or indeed the population that expects firm rule from their leaders? Is it authoritarian tendencies from certain politicians and so on?
Mm-hmm.
Back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Alejandro, I give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you. These are very good questions. So the first one about, so I guess the first questions are about methodology and about perceptions and how the household surveys work. So then a lot of the questions are about perceptions. I mean, just at the end of the day, what we want to address is how can we measure all the different elements of the rule of law, and how do and we went through a different set of exercises in trying to do so. So we could even look at various aspects of the institutions, or looking at some of the inputs of the rule of law, or some of the outcomes of the rule of law. So the reality is that comparing different aspects of the institutions becomes very challenging when one tries to do it at an international level. So, then it really becomes very difficult to compare institutions. And the solution that we have is, at the end of the day, we don't necessarily care how countries are shaping their institutions, but the outcome that the public and the people in general perceive. So then that's why just the index is mainly outcome driven. So then it's about just regardless of how the institutions, the institutional arrangement in different countries is about how in the end the different elements of the rule of law are delivered to the public. Now, it's true that in many cases there are perceptions, so it depends really on the topic. So then in some cases we try to include experience questions about the functioning of particular institutions, but in some others, particularly those elements that relate to accountability and government by law and so on, constraints on our power. So we actually have relied on a lot of perception questions. So perceptions are important as well. So it's not necessarily disregard them as useless, because perceptions actually talk about just how the public, how the people are making their decisions. We always talk about the lack of trust in institutions and so on, and this is an element the same. Just I mean, part of the reason is just that the people perceive that institutions are not functioning, right? So that's why I said that these kind of tools should be supplemented with other types of tools to come to a broader assessment. Perception change as well. Perception change when regime change. Perception change as well when countries start doing things and changing policies. So it's important. The thing is just to try to come up with a comprehensive set of issues as well to really try to measure all the different aspects as detailed as possible, not simply try to come up with one question and try to measure the rule of law with that question. As I was mentioning before, it's more than 500 questions that we try to put together. The household surveys, essentially, we interview 1,000 people in each one of the countries that we index. The surveys are conducted every 3 years. The expert surveys are conducted every year. People are asked different things. There are a few questions that are asked to both, particularly those related, some perception questions related about fundamental freedoms or general performance of the government. And in general, in most countries, the correlation is pretty high between the two the two sets of questions. In some countries, there are differences, particularly the very, very authoritarian regimes, there are differences, but in most of the countries, just the perceptions of both groups are very, very consistent. Then some questions then about just the global trend. I think, as I mentioned before, this tool is useful for trying to understand what's happening at a global scale. So this is not something that is happening in a particular region, but that is happening in various countries. The circumstances are different in various countries, and the reasons why they are happening are different in various countries, but in many cases, the outcomes are similar. So that's why we try to present information as disaggregated as possible. So today I presented summaries just of declines, but similar to what happens in economics, just when we have we want to know what's happening at the global level, and the fundamental reasons why a country is growing or declining may differ from others, but it's important to understand just also both things. Just trying to predict the rule of law backsliding, I think that's a very interesting question, and that would be a very interesting exercise. Unfortunately, for doing those type of exercises, I mean, we could do something, but really for doing those type of exercises, we will need much more longitudinal data over the years, how things change, in order to see to predict certain outcomes just out of the sample, using a sample to predict, and then just seeing whether the model actually predicts things correctly. And we have a few years of data now. So distinguish between the trend in the EU and other trends, I think, just as I was saying, it really depends on the country. Just we analyze each one of the countries. When we collect the data, we collect qualitative sources as well, and trying to understand what's happening in the different countries as well. And the situations are very different, as well as the causes. And we don't really try to go into the causes of why people feel this way, or the practitioners feel this way. But the causes are very different. In many cases, sparked by individual events. In some other cases, sparked by individual policies, reactions over what's happening. So it really varies by country, including just the individual mechanisms by which people actually may think a particular way. But this is useful just this is the equivalent of having a thermometer. So then once you know, okay, so you have a fever, so then we need to explore just in more detail. So what are the causes for that fever? So, but it's really just trying to have kind of a diagnostic with as much as possible the symptoms of different countries to really go into more analysis of what's driving them.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. And Natasha, perhaps you want to come in very, very briefly. We know that you have to leave relatively soon.
Yes, thank you. No, I think these were very useful remarks by Alejandro, and the questions, and then what you added with the questions as well. I don't know if we can, about the question about prediction, but certainly prevent and prevention is something that these kind of instruments, and it was also presented like that, but the EU can serve. I mean, there are things that have been documented that are real or and perceived that we can think of preventing for the next round, rather than predicting worsening or better. The point, Axel, you made on that the EU has embarked in this action plan, interinstitutional action plan, externally and not internally. It has also set up a number of guidelines on human rights and rule of law externally, and it never did that internally. I think we have the privilege to have the EU to have, you know, both of these external and internal action, and there's more to learn from that, from what we did externally, and take forward internally. And the point of Alejandro, I will end on the complementarity of tools and actionable, you know, principles. I think this is really something that would be very important for the whole legitimacy and future of the new cycle on rule of law that the Commission thinks about. We always hear the Commission, mostly alone, saying we are prepared to use all our tools at our disposal to address this issue. Now, it would be important that this we is not only the Commission, it's the three institutions together, and that they share responsibility and plan together how they're going to do that. And for what objective, not only telling us what they've done each in their area, but to achieve what objectives and how they're linking their different whether it be political leverage, legal leverage, different types of instruments, when they're making the links and using them together, not to create the lost in definition translation, as Alejandro was saying, but to act, to have action-oriented policies and results for rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And I'm afraid our time is up. We would be able, of course, to go on and on. I think if something could still be added, then it is this. And I think it's very much in the line of what the Commission also tries to do. A report like this, an index like this, and Alejandro has alluded to the fact, that you have to quantify things to give it a number, and with the numbers there comes a certain kind of awareness, and it is this awareness that I think reports like the one that you presented today of the World Justice Project are bringing to the fore, that can create an atmosphere of understanding, especially amongst the citizens, why the rule of law matters and why backsliding is actually something that should be worrisome. I don't want to talk about the rule of law as a pandemia these days, because I think that's it's not the right metaphor, but it may be useful to also look into how, in fact, we can create an awareness around the subject, very similar to some of the other challenges that we are facing globally these days. I think this would do a lot of positive consequences to the rule of law subject, and ultimately the need to invest in the rule of law, not only in Europe, also outside of Europe. And I think with that being said, I would like to kind of close this panel by thanking everybody, especially our attendances. I see there are still more than 70 out there. We had more than 90 at the beginning, so it's great that all of them were with us. Alejandro, being tuned in from Phoenix, we appreciate how early in the morning you've been able to present your very interesting report. Natasha from Brussels, Ted from Washington, D.C., and Alex from Brussels as well. So thank you, and let's keep the debate going. Thank you very much for this very interesting panel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.